In 1650, Jesuit scholar and polymath Athanasius Kircher published Musurgia Universalis, a music theory treatise which attempted to compile ancient and contemporary thoughts, ideas, and practices of music into one unified work. The treatise spans 10 books, each exploring a different facet of music, from Book 1, which details the physiology of the ear, to Book 10, which discusses the infamous harmony of the spheres, an idea that the motion of celestial bodies in relation to the earth can be thought of as a kind of inaudible music. Mars, for instance, as measured by its angular motion across the sky, produces a close 2 to 3 relationship between itself and the earth. This can be mapped musically as a perfect fifth. Saturn relates by a ratio approximating 5 to 4. A major third. When most people talk about Musurgia Universalis, this is the bit that they tend to focus on. But tucked away in the dusty old pages of Book 8, we find the blueprints for a curious, little-known invention of Kircher's, the Arca Musarithmica. The Arca was sort of an early computational music writing device intended for anyone, especially non-musicians, to be able to generate a working 4-part vocal harmony for any given text in any language. Working like an early mechanical computer of sorts, the Arca was meant to, through a series of inputs and selections, generate liturgical music that utilized a range of counterpoint, from simple to florid. Now, there's only a handful of surviving Arcas that exist today, none of which I was able to get my hands on. So rather than going full national treasure on the situation, I thought it might be fun to build one myself. I mean, I have scans of Kircher's original plans, so combining that with what's publicly available on the Organum Mathematicum, a sequel device Kircher made, I should be able to recreate the Arca pretty faithfully. After what feels like an eternity of combing through countless photos, translating obscure Latin treatises, consulting early music theory experts, and transcribing literal music code from the 17th century onto hand-punched wooden tablets, I think I've finally come to a place where I'm ready to show you how it all works. So, from the depths of a nearly forgotten chapter of music theory history, I present to you the world's first music-making computer, the Arca Musarithmica. Let's find out how it works. Inside the Arca, you'll find a set of tarifa, numeric tablets written or stamped on baculi, or wooden strips that contain coded instructions for different musical inputs. Some baculus are strophic, relating to meter, rhythm, and syllabic information, and some are tonus, relating to melodic, harmonic, and modal properties. The Arca isn't really a computer in the sense that it is mechanical or automatic. You won't find any working parts or gears inside, although it probably wouldn't be too difficult for a competent engineer to redesign it that way. No, the Arca is more like what Jim Baumgartner called a glorified recipe box in his 2009 paper on Musurgia mechanics. The Arca is a computer in that it computes. It computes 4-part vocal harmony for any text or lyrics, but the user was meant to do most of the heavy lifting. Take Ave Maris Stella. This is a medieval Marian hymn commonly sung at Vespers. Many composers throughout history have taken its text as a basis for composition. Take this version from Monteverdi. Or what about this interpretation from Grieg? If we examine the structure of the hymn, we can see a syllabic pattern of 3 groupings of 2 per line start to emerge. Viewers of Adam Neely's channel might recognize this as a trochee.
A trochee is a foot that has a stressed syllable followed by a weak syllable.
Ave Maris Stella, Dei mater alma, atque semper vigo, felix celi porta. Please forgive my butchering of ecclesiastical Latin pronunciations, and in return, I'll resist the urge to set this church hymn to the most fashionable flow in modern hip-hop. Although, now that you mention it, the former French colony of Acadia, which encompassed parts of modern-day Canada, once adopted Ave Maris Stella as its colonial anthem. So who knows, maybe there is room for some unnamed, disgraced Canadian rapper out there to stage a nationally charged comeback by spitting some mad trochaic bars over his land's once proud anthem. Though I'd probably recommend that unnamed rapper to stay away from the original key of A minor. But I digress. The Arca gives us several different options of accommodating different species of poetic meter. We have Archilochian tablets for setting phrases in iambic tetrameter with 8 syllables per line, Sapphic tablets for patterns of 11, 11, 11, 5, and Euripidean baculi, which work with trochaic trimeter, apparently in the style of Euripides, with 6 syllables per phrase. Since Ave Maris Stella uses 6 syllables per phrase, we'll use the Euripidean baculi to generate our harmony. There are 4 different ones to choose from, but since the original baculi were quite large and I didn't have stamps smaller than this, I decided to break them up into 4 different groupings containing 7 smaller tablets each. This actually turned out to be a good thing and kind of like an unintended bonus as far as creativity was concerned. When you do it this way, you can kind of shuffle through different harmony options like you're playing a deck of cards or something. Included in each group of tablets are applicable toni you can choose from. In the Euripidean stropha, you can select any tonus 1 through 4. These are essentially modes, but not quite the Greek modes that you're probably used to. Through much of the 16th century, church modes were commonplace, so we're looking at naming conventions like Hypophrygian instead of Locrian, and unfamiliar numerical designations like Lydian now being the 5th mode instead of the 4th. Modal theory was honestly quite a mess during this time period. There were a lot of theorists about, all kind of proposing different methods and different models of understanding, often using the same words to mean completely different things. So for a good primer and a rough timeline on how modes were thought of in the 16th and 17th century, go check out this video from early music sources, or this book from Michael Dodd. Links in the description. Each one of these modes is said to have a different mood associated with it. For example, mode 1 was said to be pious and religious, while mode 6 was glorious and warlike. We're gonna go with mode 3, which Kircher tells us is tearful and mourning sounding, evoking feelings of sadness. On the original plans for the Arca, mode 3 is given as Phrygius, which one would probably assume would just be Phrygian, but it looks more like what we would call Aeolian in modern times, with an occasional implied sharp 7. The Phrygia naming, combined with the fact that this mode tonicizes the note A specifically, tells us that we're probably working instead with a variant of the tuoni system, which was a psalm tone-inspired modal approach that emerged in the beginning of the 17th century. In this system, the specific note that we highlight and end on, the finalis, is given a kind of fixed importance compared to how we think and look about modes in modern times. Today, we can have Lydian in any key, and it's all just Lydian. All of our modes are fully transposable. And while the 8 tuoni are certainly theoretically transposable, what we observe in historical practice is that mode 3 almost always starts and ends on the literal note A. Probably not too surprising to my fellow ethnomusicology nerds out there, but there's some really interesting parallels to Makam theory hidden inside the Arca's walls. And when I say hidden, I mean hidden. These old treatises are often hard to come by, difficult to translate, and even more challenging to interpret through the nuance of 1,000 years of history. If you don't know exactly where to look, you'd never even know that they existed. This is obviously not ideal in musicology research, but it's exactly what you want when it comes to your personal data security, which is where today's sponsor, Incogni, comes in. If your email box is anything like how mine used to be before I used Incogni, then it's spam, spam, spam. And if you've ever wondered how spammers get your information in the first place, the answer is they probably bought it. There is an entire information market out there where your data is being bought and sold on the regular. They know your name, your social security number, your age, your phone number, your email address, where you live, what you do, what you buy online, even your browsing history. All of this has been collected and is sold on these massive lists regularly. And it's not even just like one list either, it's hundreds, maybe thousands of them. The good news is that we have the right to demand our name and information be taken off of these lists. The bad news is that it's often very tedious and time-consuming to do so. Incogni is a tool that helps solve all this. Simply sign up, give them the right to act on your behalf, and they'll do all the heavy lifting, going from list to list, demanding that all of your personal information be taken off. If the data brokers push back, Incogni will stand their ground and update you every step of the way until your personal information is completely wiped from every list out there. In today's digital world, you have become the commodity. And that's just not right. So become like your favorite obscure music theory treatise today and disappear almost entirely with Incogni. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use code Levi McLean at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. That's incogni.com/Levi McLean. Special thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Now back to the Arca. Since we've selected our Tonus, we can now start choosing some tablets and start stringing together our harmony. For each tablet, we have 4 lines of numbers representing 4 different voices. The top 3 lines can be mixed and matched, swapping parts to our heart's content, but the bass on the bottom line should always remain static. The numbers correspond to pitches found on the tone table under the lid of the Arca. Since we're using Tonus 3, we follow this column to transcribe our tablets into notes. But what about the rhythm, I feel you wondering through the screen? Well, for that, we simply consult the Note Temporis. On the original Barclay, rhythm sequences were indicated with notes like this. But again, I have neither the stamp nor the skill to engrave music notes like that, so I substituted the notes for numbers instead. 8 equals an eighth note, 4 are quarter notes, 2 are half notes, and 1 are whole notes. Dots make them, dotted. So we can begin to string a melody line together like this.
Ave Maris Stella, Dei Mater Alma.
Now we simply keep going like this until the text is fully populated with harmony, and there you go. We have successfully used the Arca to write a 4-part harmony for Ave Maris Stella. Now, when it came to actually recording this so you guys can hear what this all sounds like, I ran into a little bit of a problem. Longtime viewers of the channel will know this, that my ability to sing is like non-existent. And so my capacity for historically informed liturgical song, as you could imagine, is even worse. So I decided to hire a professional vocalist with extensive organic background in plain chant, ecclesiastical pronunciation, and historically informed performance to sing this arrangement for me. The goal here was to get as close as possible to a historically informed Arca performance. I wanted to convey how the people of Kircher's day might have used this little recipe box and what it might have sounded like to churchgoers in 1650. What you're about to hear is a complete 4-part vocal harmony written by an algorithm from perhaps the world's first music computer.
Ave Maris Stella, Dei Mater Alma, atque semper Virgo, Felix Celi porta, sum mensi luda
Now, let's address this salacious claim that the Arca is a computer or that its function is somehow an algorithm. This was the open question that was left for us at the conclusion of Jim Baumgartner's paper, Kircher's Mechanical Composer, a Software Implementation. Is it disingenuous to call Kircher's procedure an algorithm? Baumgartner reasoned that if you define an algorithm as a sequence of well-defined instructions, then clearly Kircher's procedure was intended to be an algorithm. Although, to be fair, those instructions are often unclear and sometimes contradictory. Earlier, I mentioned that Phrygius, in the historical context of Kircher's writings, would sometimes have a raised seventh and other times not. The text is unclear and, as far as I can tell, fails to set a rule set that determines when you should use one or the other. Kircher expects the user to already be familiar with the aesthetics of the style well enough to implicitly know when and where to employ a sharp seventh over a natural seventh. The instructions never explicitly tell us. Sometimes the Arca will end up producing a melody or a few notes that are just out of range for a specific performer or an ensemble. One is instructed to simply transpose by an octave or a fifth when this happens. But again, Kircher never really explicitly tells us when to use the octave and when to use the fifth. Most of these cases have a fairly obvious choice to me or you, but remember the Arca was intended for non-musicians, what Kircher called a musicus, or tiro, meaning novice. For an automatic algorithm, it sure does require a lot of human judgment, input, experience, and knowledge to be able to get it off the ground. Baumgartner definitionally requires a sequence of well-defined instructions. As it turns out, the Arca instructions are maybe not so well defined. Does that make it not an algorithm? Or does it just make it not a particularly good one? Moreover, the operation of the box was intended for humans, not machines. The Arca has no working mechanical mechanism inside of it. Should that matter in defining whether or not this box can be considered a computer? This question didn't stop the likes of Andrew Kashner, another Kircher scholar, from programming a working model of the Arca on his website. He points out that, quote, a computational system does not require electronic implementation. In fact, the fundamental modern concepts of computing, Turing machines, and Church's lambda calculus were defined before there existed any means of automating them. Is there a requirement of some sort of automatic mechanism, for lack of a better word, computers to be computers? What do you guys think? Do let me know in the comments below. I set Ave Maris Stella to what Kircher would call simple counterpoint, but it can go a lot deeper than that. The Arca can handle florid, melismatic counterpoint, and apparently can even generate convincing cantus firmus compositions as well. This, of course, pales in comparison to what we can do with AI tools today. But coming from 1650, this little box is pretty cool. Building my own Arca has got me thinking a lot about the documentary I released here on YouTube earlier this year. It was about how the metronome fundamentally changed how we as a culture heard, felt, and thought about rhythm and meter. Every now and again, the world is introduced to a new technology that completely flips how we think about the world on its head. In 1815, the metronome was that invention for musicians. An invention that ushered in the practical means to shift our cultural relationship with musical time itself from natural to mechanical, cementing a mathematical understanding of the nature of music into the very fabric of Western culture. Paradigm-shifting technology has the unique and terrifying power to change us irrevocably. But if we're being honest, the Arca Musarithmica is more like a very small, tiny footnote in the history of music technology. Frankly, it was inconsequential. Very few were actually made, let alone used. But the book that it belonged to, Musurgia Universalis, is one of, if not the most important music treatises in music history. A significant portion of Western theory today can be directly traced back to this compendium of knowledge collected by Kircher. And while the Arca was admittedly just a small part of that, I think its inclusion gives us a fascinating insight into how Kircher and musicians and theorists of his day across Europe understood the nature of music itself. To them, music was deeply mathematical, a fact that would be woven into every word Kircher would ever write. On his website, Andrew Kashner gives some valuable insight into the mind of Kircher, which I think is pretty valuable here. Kircher presented this, the Arca Musarithmica, as an embodiment of mathematical permutations. Like many of his 17th century contemporaries, he understood music as sounding number, an embodiment of mathematical order inherent in God's created universe, and a reflection of the perfection of God himself. Out of the infinite variety of possible combinations of notes and rhythms, the user of the arc selects a specific set of permutations and thus imitates God in his original act of creation. I once made the argument that the metronome has always been inevitable in Western music because it was ultimately a pure manifestation of the ideals Western music as a whole is built from. The metronome was an idyllic symbol for our musical ideology. This, by the way, in case you don't catch the hour-long documentary, links are going to be in the description, by the way, is not inherently a good thing, and it's not inherently a bad thing. It is interesting, though, and it's a really interesting thing to consider when we look at the Arca Musarithmica's place in history today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a beautiful day. Jordy and I would like to say a huge shout out to our patrons now currently on screen. Assieds-toi. Oh. Without our community over on Patreon, these kind of videos would just not be possible. Isn't that right, buddy? If you'd like to support the channel, Patreon is, of course, the best way to do so. When you join our microtonalist tier, you get access to the microtonalist manual, an ever-growing resource containing everything you'd ever need to know about making music in 31 Ito or how to make music with microtones. This includes tuning files, lecture notes, academic papers, and a bunch of exclusive videos like my hour-long lecture series on 31 Ito for the modern musician, the many sevenths of 31, microdrift modulation techniques, and much, much more. We also have different sample packs and sampler instruments that appear in a lot of my videos available to all of my patrons, as well as a handful of bass and production lessons. Come study with us. I make it a point to make myself available to all of our patrons to answer questions, geek out on cool music theory stuff, and help foster a thriving community of microtonal music theory nerds. We await you with open arms and, of course, a whole lot of notes.